Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. I'm going to jump into this fairly quickly because my objective is to share quite a bit of information with you in a coherent and hopefully simple enough way that you can follow it no matter what your age or whatever. Because what I want to talk about is something that is so outrageous, something that was so huge, one of the greatest atrocities ever in the world history, um, that is really glossed over much of the time in the history classes, and even when if it's dealt with at all. Um, but I gotta give a little bit of backstory because, of course, we're somewhat familiar with the rape of Africa of its people in the global slave trade. And I say global because it was not just a transatlantic slave trade. Um, it was one that dealt with the what they call the Middle East now, in terms of the um, Islamic slave trade and the European slave trade. But after that, or actually while that was still happening, really, um, something occurred. Let's go back to 1876 for a minute. And it's important that we have a better picture of what Africa was like. Um, because if we don't have an idea of what Africa was like, then it may not be clear why what occurred did occur. Okay. So let's take for a minute, let's look at this graphic for a minute. Before the Europeans divided it up, you have to understand Africa, the continent of Africa, had over 1,000 different languages and cultures and tribes and ethnicities and countries. No matter how you want to describe it, it was bunches of them. So in the figure on the left, I want you to try to imagine that here you have a continent which has millions of people with all these different groups of people. Some got along very well, some didn't, but they had been there dealing with each other for thousands of years. Okay? the figure on the right shows a little bit deeper about the ethnicity and the national boundaries, homelands. Now you see that, right? So now you, in other words, the Africans they were doing okay in terms of dealing with. Now this is even after they had been raided and you had the slave trades going on, which had stolen lots and lots of people. Okay, but here again, it's another way of looking at it. Let me see. Let me pull this up, and if you have the ability to put the screen on full screen, we can look at that a little closer. Because again, you have boundaries that pretty much the Africans had set up, and pretty much they were dealing with things. Now, certain areas they already had some things going on with Europeans, especially down in the Cape at the bottom. You already had some stuff going on there, and a few other places. But let me put it like this: at that time period, in 1876 or so, um, 80% of Africa was still under the control pretty much of Africans. Okay? Now, in 1876, you had a guy, uh, Leopold, in Belgium. Okay, let me get a different map here. Let me do it this a different way. Um, you had a guy in Belgium, King Leopold. All right, see that in the middle, the Belgian Congo. And it's interesting, right? When you think about it, Belgium is the country, and yet it was called the Belgian Congo. In 1876, King Leopold II of Belgium, he had founded and controlled an organization called the International African Association. He invited this American by the name of Henry Morton Stanley to help him research and civilize the continent. In 1878, the International Congo Society was also formed, and this had supposedly more economic goals. The first name of this society, by the way, had been called the International Association for the Exploration and Civilization of Central Africa. And Leopold secretly bought off the foreign investors of the Congo Society so he could really shape it to do what he wanted to do. And from 1878 to 1885, Stanley, and if the name sounds familiar, you probably ran across it at some point where there's a famous story or whatever about Stanley and Livingstone, same guy. But anyway, he was working for King Leopold, and so he went on a secret mission from Leopold to organize um, what would become known as the Congo Free State. All right, so there was a lot going on right there in the center. And if you notice around it, the Belgian Congo, you see German East Africa, you see French, meaning that they were under the French control, Port West Africa, Rhodesia, okay, German West Africa. Um, so right there in the center is this dude King Leopold. All right. Now, why was he so busy there? Well, we'll come back to that a little bit later because he was trying to put things in his uh, to organize stuff to his advantage. Well, the French spies, the intelligence agencies, and they had them back then, uh, they said, "Oh no, 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 no! We got to get in this," and that's how come you see French there, and right up above that, Equatorial Africa, and over there on the Ivory Coast, over to the left and above, you see Ivory Coast. That came under the French control. Madagascar down here on the far right, okay, and it's, Madagascar, the same one that they had the movies about, which always pisses me off because if you see those movies and they were aimed at children, but that's why it's so dangerous. Think about it. They're cute, right? But they don't show any human beings. So you have these Madagascar movies with the cute animals being personified, meaning you have animals take on human characteristics and behaviors. But if you don't show the people at all, then children, especially, they grow up with a totally distorted idea of what Madagascar is. So anyway, so you had the French get involved in what is now called the Republic of Congo. You had Spain, and you had and Spain was in deep with the Roman Catholic Church, and they made treaties with the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland to cut off the Congo's access to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so you had a lot of stuff going on, and that's why it's important that we understand that Africa was seen as this great resource, and all these countries are getting involved. So here you go with this guy called the Bismarck, and this is for your own research to do it another time. But I just mentioned this. There was this dude, he was called the Bismarck. This is over in Germany, and he was making moves over there. And if you look at the history, you'll see that he was known in this time period as the Second Reich. Now, of course, Hitler and them, the Nazis, they were considered the Third Reich. And so you want to find out what was the First Reich, the Second Reich, so that you better understand the Third Reich. But anyway, Bismarck was busy trying to make sure Germany had its influence on things. And so he proposed that in order to make sure Germany had its play, he proposed a conference. It came to be known as the Berlin Conference. It had some other names as well because uh, initially, and let's see here, it says the Berlin Conference was a meeting of 14 nations to discuss territorial disputes in Africa. The meeting was held in Berlin, Germany from November 1884 to February 1885 and included representatives from the United States and such European nations as Britain, France, and Germany. And I'll go into the whole 14 countries in a minute. But understand there were no Africans invited to the conference. I want you to keep that in mind as we're going through this. This took place in Europe, in Germany. No Africans were invited to deal with territorial disputes in Africa. This is why I said this is actually this was a huge thing going on. The Berlin Conference took place at a time when European powers were rushing to establish direct political control in Africa. This race to expand European colonial influence is often referred to as the scramble for Africa. Europeans called the Berlin meeting because they felt rules were needed to prevent war over claims to African lands. Y'all with me here? How deep this is. Okay? Uh this is just unbelievable because as you begin to really open your mind to what this was about, it was like, what? Uh let's do this now. Let's look at the 14 countries that were involved. There was Austria Hungary. At that time, they were considered one country. Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, the Ottoman Empire. And you need to look that up if you don't know what that was. In fact, you probably ran across this phrase in some point in your history classes, but you need to know. Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, at that time they were one, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Okay? Um, whoo boy. Now, let's see. Uh, so remember, at the time of the conference, what I show you, the time of the conference, the Africa was under the control, 80% of it was under control of Africans. Okay? Uh, but then they decided to have this conference. And they started in November of 1885. Um, what they ultimately did was the crime of the century because these 14 countries, which was all white men, they proceeded to set these boundaries and set up these artificial countries. They took what was over 1,000 indigenous cultures and regions of Africa and divided them up into what eventually became 50 something countries. Woo, Lord. Of the 14 countries, by the way, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Portugal were the major players. It's a graphic with some of the representatives. Okay, and there they are standing out front, looking all imperialistic. Now, let's ask ourselves, why was this so important to do? Why were they fighting over this? Or why did they decide to meet to decide to divide it up so that they wouldn't fight over it? Well, let's talk about resources for a minute here. Okay, if you can put this on full screen, that's good. Because I want to look at this for a second. You see, Africa was recognized for having lots of resources. Now back then, it wasn't known all of the resources, but they did know that they had plenty of gold and diamonds, rubber, you know. So they knew Africa was full of resources. Now this is a later map that shows all the different kind of stuff because when you look at oil production, gas production, diamonds, uranium, copper, manganese, iron ore, and of course gold. They saw this, they said, "Ooh, Lord, oh, there's so much stuff here." Okay? Um, And so they were dividing up so they could get all the good stuff. Now, where are the Africans in this? You say, well, wow, what was the deal here? The Africans, kind of like when they went on a scramble for what we know as the United States today, North America. People there, but they act like they didn't even matter. Um, let's look at this map of Europe for a second here. Look at these countries that were involved, right? What do we say? We said Austria, Hungary. All right, let's see if we can find Hungary. Right in the center, lower center, you'll see a blue Slovenia, and right underneath Slovenia, and right next door to Romania, and right next to Austria, you see Austria, Hungary. Austria and Hungary. This is separate now, but back then it was one. And Belgium. Now, Belgium is actually very tiny. So let's see, where is Belgium? Uh, all right, to the, you see where the United Kingdom is over to the left, right? All right, right below it to the right, between Germany and France, is Belgium. So you see how tiny that is. Then Denmark is up above Germany. France, of course, you see France and Germany. Great Britain. Oh yeah, Italy. Let's not forget Italy down there, at directly in the center at the bottom is Italy. Um, the Netherlands. The Netherlands is another one of them tiny ones. Uh, well, it's up here at the top, and Sweden and Norway were one. Okay, the Netherlands is on this map. You can barely tell, but it's right there where Denmark is. All right, right above Germany, right to the left above Germany. That's the Netherlands. And Portugal, let's see, where is Portugal? Portugal's tiny too. Oh, come down to France, down to Spain, which is another country, and there's Portugal on the left of Spain. We say Russia, look over there to the right, there's Russia. And Turkey, Turkey, right down at the bottom right, there's Turkey. Now, it's interesting because today, in today's world, there's a lot going on with Ukraine and Turkey. Yeah, there's a lot going on with that, ain't it? Hmm. So understand where they are. But again, of those 14 countries, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Portugal were the major players. All right. Now, in the beginning of the conference, the purpose was to, let me see, let me put this up here. Um, oh no, I need to find this here. Okay. The purposes of the conference in the beginning was to agree that the Congo River and the Niger River, or Niger River, that their mouths and basins would be considered neutral and open to trade. However, part of the Congo Basin, which you can see on this graphic right here, you see the river running around there, running around the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Well, of course, King Leopold took control of that because he was controlling the Congo. When I say controlling it, he made it his personal possession. Yeah, his personal possession. And then he proceeded over the years to kill off half of the population. We'll talk about that in a minute. At the time of the conference, only the coastal areas of Africa were colonized by the European powers. So the conference then they went to dealing with carving up the entire continent. The entire continent. Do you all hear what I'm saying? 3 months from November to February, they haggled and bargained over the geometric boundaries of the interior of the continent. They didn't care nothing about the tribes or the countries or the cultures or the languages or the people who lived there. They carved that up and in the process slammed people together. The French, that's the graphic they're dealing with. The French, they wanted certain things for themselves. The British, oh, they were really big time because they wanted. You'll see a graphic come up in a minute. The British wanted control of the Suez Canal. Okay, there you go. They wanted that as a shortcut to Asia. Okay, see all these things we kind of they were mentioned in our history classes about the Suez Canal and all this stuff, but they didn't really tell us what was going on. They were carving up Africa. And I know some of you all are saying, well, what was going on with the United States, with black people in the United States? I'll tell you in a minute. Um, One of the things that was going on here with the conference, the British they were monsters. There was a guy named Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, of course, Rhodesia was named after him. The Rhodes Scholars is named after him. But one of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to make sure the British had what he called control from Cape Town to Cairo. Look at that for a second, and that will begin to tell you what we're talking about here. Cape Town in South Africa to Cairo, Egypt. That's why when he's standing there like that, he's talking about they wanted to control from Cairo all the way down to Cape Town. Wow. And to a degree, they almost succeeded. They almost succeeded. They had so much control. In fact, that was part of what we talked about a few weeks ago about how um, the, the saying used to be that the sun never sets on the British Empire because all over the world they had so much control. But we'll come back to that in a minute because what I want to deal with right now is go back to the Congo for a second. Um, what King Leopold did? I hear you see it. This is the Congo, right? And there were two groups there primarily, the Tutsi and the Hutu. And what he did was he set it up so that one group had more privileges and everything than the other group. And in the process, set up for one of the worst genocidal battles or genocides in the history of the world. When nearly 1 million Tutsis were killed in what was called a civil war by the Hutu. Um, One of the things that was, and they've done some movies, some other things, and tried to play it off that it was just basically Africans killing Africans. But they dismissed the whole reality of what occurred. The Belgians, under King Leopold, he started all of that. You need to check that out. If you've never seen the history of what King Leopold did, he wanted the rubber, and so he had his soldiers over there, and people had to deliver so much rubber, and if they didn't, they cut their hands off. And we're talking about men, women, and children. Um, if you look, you'll find something called Belgian chocolate. At one time, they even had chocolate that was in the shape of hands, because if the people didn't bring in enough rubber, then people who were in charge, who were kind of like slave, what do you call them? Not slave masters, but the supervisors, they had to deal with their bosses, so they would cut off the hands and bring the hands. I mean, this was some sick stuff. And then they supplied one group with thousands of machetes. And so when the so-called Civil War broke out, when see Belgium decided, okay, now we're gonna leave y'all alone, and they acted like they were granting independence to the Congo, but they had set it up already so that they went to war with each other, and so you had this genocide jump off. The Hutus supposedly killed 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus, but that was the result of European imperialism, and it specifically was Belgium and King Leopold. Okay? That was one of the terrible things that African people still to this day, black people still, we don't know the true history, and so we believe what we've been told, even from the movies that have been made, that made it seem like all these Africans just killed each other because they're heathens. No, stuff was set up. Okay? Now, one of the things that came out of the conference that's very important to understand is something called the principle of effective occupation. The principle of effective occupation. And what it was, it stated that the European powers could acquire the rights over the land only if they possessed them or had effective occupation. And this tripped me out because when I was growing up, we used to hear this thing about possession is 9/10 of the law. And that was, that was used as a thing to say, well, it's my toy now because possession is 9/10 of the law. We never knew where that came from. That was some more of that European stuff. They said that if one of the European countries had effective occupation, in other words, if they had treaties with local leaders, if they flew their flag there, and if they established an administration in the territory to govern it with a police force to keep order, that was considered effective occupation. See, now think about it. How many times have you seen in the movies and stuff where they would plant the flag? Plant the flag. See, that was part of effective occupation. That and, of course, establishing a police force, which would be usually the military. And they would have treaties with the local leaders by choice or by force. And then they could, at that point, make use of the colony economically. In other words, they could rip them for their um, resources. Now, this conference was 1884 to 1885. When they got through, let's look at this map closer. All right, when they got through, this is kind of how they divided stuff up. Okay, you see up here at the top, way up at the beginning at the top altogether, this Spain has some of its territory, right? And but right there, there's so much French West Africa. The Italians got a little bit over there to the right. On the left coast, the Ivory Coast was. You got British, you got Portuguese, you got British, you got free. Uh-huh. That's interesting that they call that free. That's Liberia. British, German, Spanish, French, the British. And if you look overall, there's two countries that have the most. That's British and French. The Belgians got their huge centerpiece. Spain has a little bit, and the Italians got a little bit. But the British and the French had the most. Germany is down there to the bottom and a little bit over there in the middle too. The Portuguese had some too. Okay? But it's interesting on this map, they like to say free over there, all the way over to the left. That was Liberia. That was what the United States had. Because remember, the United States has set up Liberia supposedly to send slaves. Okay, they said, well, y'all can go back home. um, look at this one a little closer too. By 1902, 90% of the land that makes up Africa was under European control. So within roughly 7 years or so, they had managed to gobble it up based on that carving it up that they did in Berlin. By 1914, here's a map from 1914. Look at it now. Okay, the French were still the main ones. The British, the Portuguese had gotten more. Belgium, it stretched their stuff out in the middle. Germany had theirs. The Spanish still had theirs. The Italian, and Ethiopia was considered independent, as was Liberia. See, you see Liberia is mentioned where it said free on that other map. It was considered independent. It wasn't independent. It was a colony of the United States. Okay. Libya up there at the top, that was under Italian, that was under Italy. So 90% of the country, of the continent of Africa was under the control of the Europeans. Mm. Um, let me deal with this. They had turned it into 50 countries, all right? So Great Britain desired a Cape to Cairo collection of colonies. They had control of Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya. That was known as British East Africa, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, which at the time was called Rhodesia, and Botswana. They also controlled Nigeria and Ghana on the Gold Coast. And you should understand why these coasts were called different things. The Gold Coast was considered the Gold Coast not because of gold, but because of people. Black gold. That's where the majority of the Africans who was shipped out of there over to the Americas, they went out on that coast, which they called the Gold Coast for black gold. Because remember, gold was heavily down in South Africa in the southern part. But it was also an area over there called the Ivory Coast, Why was it called the Ivory Coast? Because they were killing the elephants and taking that ivory. See, think about this. You may not be old enough to remember or to even know this, but at one time, the keys on the pianos were made out of ivory. They used to call it tickling the ivories because the keys were made out of ivory. Then later they started making them out of plastic. But for years, and in fact, the best pianos are considered those with ivory. So they were ripping the continent of its elephant's tusks. Okay, France took much of Western Africa, from Mauritania to Chad, as well as Gabon and the Republic of Congo, which was French Equatorial Africa. And then, of course, Belgium and King Leopold II controlled the Democratic Republic of Congo, or as we saw earlier, it was called the Belgian Congo. Portugal took Mozambique in the east and Angola on the west. Italy had Somalia and a portion of Ethiopia. Germany took Namibia, that's down there on the left hand side, and they did some genocidal stuff in what is called Namibia. It was called Southwest Africa then, and Tanzania. That was German East Africa. Spain had the smallest territory, what was called Equatorial Guinea. So you see, they had divided it up and then gobbled it up. And the reason why I wanted to deal with this today is so that we would have a much better understanding of just how terrible this was. How Africa got to be where it is today. Because what did they do? They didn't just take it over, they imposed their cultures on those countries. They forced them to learn the languages, follow their dictates. They educated the people. That's why French became one of the primary languages, English and Portuguese. If you want to know how strong the influence was, look at Brazil today. It's the primary language is what? Portuguese. And remember, go back and look at the maps, and you see Portugal is tiny, tiny. But they had so much influence. Okay? Um, ooh, Lord. Uh, Let me see one other thing here. Oh, I know what I was going to do. Need to talk about the United States because one of the things, and I've heard this before, some folks say, well, what was the United States? What was black people doing in the United States? Why wasn't they helping? Well, let's go back to the 1880s and 90s in the United States. I'm going to leave the African map up there so you can keep this in your head. 1883 in the United States, there was something going on called the civil rights cases. Not the civil rights case, it was the civil rights cases. In 1883 in the United States, it was a group of 5 cases in which the Supreme Court of the United States held that the 13th and 14th Amendments did not empower Congress to outlaw racial discrimination by private individuals. This decision has never been overturned. In other words, what they were saying was the 13th Amendment merely abolishes slavery. And as Ava DuVernay has shown us, and others have shown us, it didn't totally get rid of slavery because it still allowed it if you were convicted of a crime. But they said it merely abolished slavery. And the 14th Amendment did not give Congress the power to outlaw private acts of racial discrimination. Think about that. See, in other words, black folks had sued because private individuals were um, discriminating against them. And the court said, yeah, they can do that. And that decision in 1883, remember you had the radical reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. And then you had the compromise, which pulled the Union soldiers out of the South and opened the South up to where them white folks went crazy. The former slave owners, the former Civil War people, they went to acting crazy, taking all this stuff back because black people in that 12 years of the Reconstruction had done stuff that scared them to death. They said these black people, at the rate they're going, they done took over the whole South. So they spent from then on, from 1877 on, taking it all back. So that decision in 1883 ushered in the wide segregation of black people in housing, employment, and public life that confined us to second class citizenship throughout much of the United States until the passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s. Okay? Black people in those five cases um, sued theaters, hotels, and transit companies that refused to admit them or had excluded them from whites only facilities. Now, something else was going on in this period because what was going on was during Reconstruction, freedmen, that's what they called the former enslaved, they were called freedmen, and some white people working in the South for civil rights were attacked and they started getting lynched. Black voting was suppressed by violence as well as poll taxes and literacy tests. Um, Whites had regained control of the state legislatures in 1876. And in 1877, like I say, the government removed the federal troops from the South. And it was all hell broke loose. You had the rise of Jim Crow. You had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. You had the rise of lynching as a way to control black people. Now, those who don't know, Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. You have to understand that these were laws. Don't let them fool you into thinking that it was just a custom. These were laws that were made. That's why when you get down to the 50s and 60s and you saw black people demonstrating, especially in the South, who would be beating them? It was the police. When you think about Martin Luther King and all of them, they were challenging the laws. So don't let nobody trick you into thinking that was just a few people, few rotten apple white people. These were the laws. Okay. Um, the Jim Crow laws were upheld in 1896 in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the United States Supreme Court laid out the separate but equal legal doctrine for the United States. What did that mean? It meant that the states could put us in separate facilities, separate schools, separate whatever. And they were supposed to be equal, but it allowed them to do it legally to segregate. Okay? That's what was going on in the United States, along with, of course, lynchings. And lynchings went on roughly from 1890 down all the way to the 1920s. Actually into the 1950s and 60s in some cases. But they were lynching us like crazy from roughly 1879, 1880 to 1920. So, in other words, while Africa was being carved up and the resources were being stolen, that's how come the black people in the United States were, number one, not even if they were aware of it, it wasn't like we had the internet or CNN news. But we had some serious stuff going on here. Okay, they were busy killing us and lynching us and raping us and taking back all of our gains we had made. And of course, the educational part was, of course, keeping us believing that, or teaching us to believe that Africa was a backwards place and we should be glad we're here, and all the Africans, swung in trees. It was a vicious place to be on the earth. So as I close, I just wanted you to get an idea of what this was really about at that time so that we understand better the grand theft, international grand theft that all those countries I named, all those 14 European countries and the United States, what they did to us, I mean us being African people, what they did to the continent that still affects us to this day, because you get down to the late 50s and get into the 60s and you had the independence movements. But then when you start to study that, you'll understand what they were dealing with and why, even to this day, the influence and the control of the colonization of Africa still haunts us to this day. Okay? All right, I thank you. And as always, I say no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW. Mm, wow. Yeah.